Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the world. My name is Mike. I'm here to present conveniently located convenience stores or inconvenient conveni, which is a capstone presentation for the University of Arizona's Geographic Information Systems Technology graduate program for spring of 2025. Some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to start off with what the actual research objectives were and my motivation behind them. Talking about that, we're going to have to talk about what the actual primary research subject of this capstone was, which was 7&I Holdings, where we are in the world and why we're actually there, the data sources that were used, and some of the methodology that was applied to them, the key findings that were extracted from that methodology, and then conclusions based off those findings as they relate to the actual research objectives. So the primary research objectives for this were to just take Japanese census data, see if we could identify a valid regression model to identify where 7-Elevens are within the world. If you saw in the actual background images up to this point, you may have seen 7-Elevens in the actual background. But truth be told, they aren't 7-Elevens. Those are 7&I Holdings locations. I live in Japan, where 7-Eleven happens to be the most prolific and the most dominant convenience store location within the country and in the world. And convenience stores out here represent like not just a convenience or where you can go get things. They're an everyday part of life where you can go get breakfast, lunch, and dinner, your basic toiletries. They act as banks. They have ATMs with them, purchasing tickets for events that are happening in your area. They also serve as emergency centers in the event of catastrophes. So, looking at this, I live in Okinawa, Japan, where only recently I've noticed that 7-Elevens have actually started to expand on the island. So compared to their main competitors, I actually wanted to see like, hey, like where does 7-Eleven actually need to expand to at least maintain their dominance or become the dominant convenience store location on the actual island. So my research objectives were as follows. One, take Japanese census data to see if a valid regression model could be identified. Two, following that, to see if that model actually aligned with 7-Eleven's business practices and what they actually marketed towards. But finally, taking that valid regression model and actually applying it to future site selection to see whether or not, or see where 7-Eleven could actually expand on the island. But talking about 7-Eleven, their parent company is 7&I Holdings. They started off as the Southland Ice Company in 1927, where they were established the very first convenience store in the world in Dallas, Texas. From 1928 to 1946, they were referred to as totem stores, and this was because one of their store holders took a totem pole, slapped it in front of her store, and all the other retail locations, because of how well that worked in a marketing scheme for them, they all followed suit and all put totem poles in front of all their stores. So from 1928 to 1946, they were referred to as totem stores. And because of their success, they actually extended their hours of operation from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., which is conveniently where they actually get their name 7-Eleven from. The next most notable thing happened to be in 1973 when Ita Yokado, which is a supermarket company based in Japan, signs a franchisee agreement with Southland Ice Company to bring 7-Eleven to Japan under 7-Eleven Japan or SEJ. SEJ sees huge success with convenience stores in Japan and what they're able to offer and everything with that. And by 1991, SEJ buys a 70% stake in Southland Ice Company and changes their name to 7-Eleven Incorporated. So all US based stores are fall underneath 7-Eleven Incorporated. All Japanese stores fall underneath 7-Eleven Japan. But because Ida Yokado also owned a banking firm at that time, they took all three of those companies, merged them into one, which is where you get 7&I Holdings as the parent company for all three. From 91 until now, they have aggressively expanded. As I said, 7-Eleven is the world's most dominant and most common convenience store. They have over 85,000 locations across the world. They're found in over 19 countries, but 40,000 of their locations are specifically found in Japan, which is where our study area happens to be. But more specifically, Okinawa, Japan. If you're unfamiliar with the island, it's a small island in the Western Pacific. It's part of the Ryukyu Island chain, which spans from southern mainland Japan all the way down to Taiwan. which covers roughly 1,800 square miles. Administratively, it falls within the Okinawa Prefecture, which encompasses the area from Okinawa all the way down to Taiwan. The island is roughly 66 miles long, averages around 7 miles wide, giving it a square mileage of 466 square miles. But a quarter of that area is reserved for U.S. military installations and training areas. So for the application of this project, the that area was omitted from the actual study area as contracting limitations within there prevent 7-Eleven from actually expanding onto U.S. bases. The population of the island happens to be 1.4 million people. This does include U.S. service members and their families. But more importantly, of the 85,000 locations that 7-Eleven has around the world and the 40,000 that they have within Japan, only 137 of them happen to be in Okinawa. And when you compare that with their competitors, Family Mart and Lawson, those two competitors for 7-Eleven actually have almost 80% of the store locations on Okinawa. And this was really just me driving around the island and seeing like the expansion of 7-Eleven and noticing that there were more Family Marts compared to Lawson's and everything else. That was just like, hey, okay, cool. Like I just now noticed 7-Eleven expanding onto the island. Where do they need to go to actually maintain like their dominance or actually or achieve a dominant presence on the actual island? So to do that, I needed to figure out where the actual data sources were and where they actually provide those. Um, Conveniently, Google Maps, you guys can extract any open data off of Google Maps using their My Maps. So their convenience store locations, um, excuse me, their convenience store locations for 7-Elevens were all just extracted off of Google Maps. The census data was provided publicly by the Statistics Bureau of Japan. The 6 data sets that you see listed there are not all of them. There were 8. 2 of them happen to be summations of the other ones, so they were not included for this study. But all these data sets were taken into ArcGIS Pro for post-processing and pre and post-processing, and would be used in exploratory regression to identify the variables that perform the best, and that would hopefully be used in ordinary least squares with spatial autocorrelation to identify hopefully a valid model with that. But looking at that, when we actually looked at the key findings of analyzing all of these data sets individually, the data sets did very poorly on their own. None of them had any passing models. Some of the things that were consistent across the board with all of them is that they had all very low adjusted R squares, usually averaging around the 9 to 10% mark. AICs typically did not go down beyond 2 variable models and stayed stagnant beyond that. Your variance inflation factors, like at the get-go for each individual data set, were all over the place, and there was a large presence of multicollinearity within the data set. So within the 6 data sets total, there were 131 fields. But because the VIF scores for these were just all over the place and exceeding the 7.5 tolerance of this, all the fields introducing multicollinearity needed to be removed. But this was okay in the sense that those fields were primarily like summation fields of the other ones or statistical computation. So like the average household size, or like the total population, total male, total female. And other fields within the data sets already had those metrics captured. So of the 131 fields that were originally within the data set, we brought it down to 68. But the idea behind examining the individual data sets using exploratory regression was to at least identify the top performing variables within each one of the data sets, because of the 68 fields that were present, can't select every single one of those to identify a model using exploratory regression, because that's going to exceed the 100,000 models that ArcGIS Pro can actually process at a given time. I had an idea of what the business model was for 7-Elevens and them marketing towards male or female or like specific age groups. But the census data ended up breaking it down even further beyond what I was able to find for the research findings for 7-Eleven and who they marketed towards. But even then, taking all those top performing variables, taking all the 6 data sets, combining it into one, reprocessing that through exploratory regression to see which model performed best, even then, there was no top performing model. The only way to get a passing model was to lower the minimum adjusted R squares down to 0.14 or 14% and to completely omit the minimum dark bearer values and set that to 0 instead of the 0.05 as the minimum criteria. Even then, the only way there was only one passing model with the combined data sets that you see. So a combination of food service, family employee, apartments, 11 floors plus, private rentals, men ages 50 to 54. Some of those variables did make sense when it came to the marketing practices for 7-Eleven. So looking for family employees, apartment 11 floor plus, private rentals, those made sense. Um, but the men ages 50 to 54, while it is negative, more of the research that I found aligned, like looking for women ages 25 to 40 was what they were like getting at, or they're marketing towards. But a combination of food service, that's completely foreign just because I wasn't able to find whether or not 7-Eleven actually markets specifically towards that career path. Um, and so like it was very difficult to actually find a working model. And I think that was primarily due to too few dependent variables. So only 137 7-Eleven locations were able to be identified. On a whim, at the very end of this, I took all 661 locations for convenience stores, treated them all as 7-Elevens to say, like, hey, what if 7-Eleven did have 100% market cap or dominance on the actual island? When I ran that, through the exploratory regression and ordinarily squares instead of the 14% that you see based off this model, that did jump up to 30%. But what ended up happening was some of the coefficients and some of the statistically significant variables ended up becoming not statistically significant, and which would have required a lot more analysis to figure out, like, okay, based off this data set, what other variables are actually going to work within this actual, or to at least identify a valid regression model. So based off that, a lot of the conclusions that where I was able to draw was that a valid regression model could not be identified for determining where 7 locations were and why they were there because I couldn't identify where the actual model or what the model was. Um, I don't know if that model actually aligns with the 7-Eleven's business practice and what they actually market towards. Some of the variables did align with it, but not all of them were expected. But primarily because I don't have a valid regression model, I cannot use that model to identify future expansion for 7-Eleven using a valid regression model. Pending that, do you have any questions?